Everybody, welcome to our intimate gathering here. How many architects do we have here? How many psychology types? How many people are actually consider themselves both? All right. Rare breed. So, aesthetically pleasing. This is going to be something that we find compelling, interesting, moving, something that's cool, something that we like. And I'm thinking of architecture. What I'm generally thinking of is something that's fundamentally superficial, like an isolated object, something, not thinking of it so much in terms of like a holistic entity or functional aspects of architecture. It's more of superficial aspects of discrete objects. And just to start things off, so my expertise is on the psychology side of things. This is a fun opportunity to play in a sandbox that I'm not accustomed to playing in. After I'm married to an urban planner, I have many architect friends, and finally I saw this opportunity to have something to say in a context that formally is involving architecture. Also, I'm not going to be providing data, so this is a fully theoretical talk. Some of what I'm talking about is hard to argue, I think. Other things are more speculative in nature. As I'm going through these things, and these are pitfalls of attractive architecture, keep in mind that the argument is not that the problems are worse than the benefits. So it's not ultimately that we need to do something about it necessarily. It's more of let's take a thorough look at the problem. And so like in my subfield of experimental social psychology, it is a custom to overthink everything, and we pay attention to the good and the bad and the bad and the good, and this kind of falls in that category of let's overthink this. And this is ultimately not something that I'm going to be proposing an application in particular. It's more of a let's think more carefully, systematically about things that I don't think, at least in my naive sense of things, that tends to be thought about in great depth. All right, so the pitfalls that I'm going to be getting into here, one is just adaptation, getting used to things. Second one is developing a sense of intolerance for architecture. And these first two pitfalls are things that I would consider to be kind of low-hanging fruit. Basically, my interest in these topics has emerged from teaching a course on the science of happiness that whenever I get a chance to teach a seminar, I will typically teach this happiness course. And one of my favorite things to deal with is questions related to architecture. And these two pitfalls come up in conversation. So that's sort of where these ideas came from, at least on the first two. The third idea is something that I'll spend more time on than the other two. And this is a more speculative, something that I think is more contentious proposal. And my ideas related to this is not specific to architecture, but it works. I think I can work with this. It's basically looking at how good things or bad things, broadly speaking, in terms of how they're perceived, the superficial qualities, appearance of things, how that can benefit or be problematic for vitality of place. Okay. So, first pitfall. We get used to things. This is not a surprise to anybody. And if you're familiar with the happiness literature, there's great well-being literature in general. You can make divisions between satisfaction judgments, intellectual judgments of how things are versus like your emotional feelings. How does it make you feel in your gut? And the argument here would be that, because I look in this classroom is mind-blowingly aesthetically pleasing to me. Like this is like exactly, if I was going to draw up a place to work and teach, like this is really awesome. And I imagine that I would continue to feel this way if I were to be here continuously. I would say, boy, I sure feel lucky about having to be in this, getting to be in this atmosphere every day. But the real, like, wow, gee whiz, emotional impact is of course going to fade over time. And to the extent that this is a functional space, that will be a good thing that will continue over time. But in terms of my perception of it, like, does it actually add to my happiness, my well-being? Does it really make an impact on me? You know, that's going to fade over time, almost. It can't be otherwise. And this type of adaptation is more true for things that are objects, and I think I'm thinking of architecture in that kind of sense. And things that we like, unfortunately, we tend to get used to more quickly than things that we don't like. So this is another disadvantage for aesthetically pleasing things. And the real problem here would be, to what extent are you throwing resources after these hedonic experiences? So if I decide that I've seen this atmosphere and I want to be here, and if let's say this is the study in my home, like, how much am I going to invest to be able to secure this for myself? And am I taking into consideration the extent to which this is not really going to have an impact on me from a happiness standpoint, at least in terms of the aesthetics, over time? Or at least the extent to which it's going to have an impact on my happiness is going to tend to diminish over time. And am I taking that into account? I will say that when I invite architects to my Science of Happiness class to weigh in on these things, and I ask architects, so to what extent do you think about, like, happiness? I feel like the architects have a hard time dealing with this, and this just could be the people that I invite to my classes, but they typically focus on, well, like, people have a positive response to this, people like it, it works, I like it, but, like, the whole adaptation thing doesn't seem to be something that is consistently thought about. Like, perhaps that is the case, and I just don't know. But we have a hard time having a conversation about it, it seems like, with me and architects. All right, so the second issue, the second pitfall is intolerance. So if you are someone who pays attention to architecture, you have an appreciation for what is pleasing and what is not pleasing, you notice things. Now, another way you can think about that is you notice things that you don't like. So when you develop you become an aficionado of architecture, and you start paying attention to the details, you're noticing the good things and you're noticing the bad things. Is this a good thing? Maybe, but from a standpoint of your emotional well-being, your happiness, is it necessarily a good thing that when you're driving down the highway, you have negative appraisals of things? It makes you mad when you look and you see snout houses or windows that have shutters that could not possibly close over the sides of the window, or windows that are not recessed. You know, these little kinds of details that it's a fun game, I think, in some ways, to sort of look at things and notice it, but is it ultimately a good thing that you would develop intolerance? And from a social standpoint, if, like, you have a hard time dealing with these kinds of what you consider to be architectural failings, it's not exactly a social thing. People that are less aficionados are bothered by this you know, why are you worrying about the details? So you become basically less adaptable, less flexible, less capable of being content in environments that perhaps are not idealistic from your standpoint in terms of architecture. So I don't think, anyhow, I don't think these two pitfalls are particularly hard to argue. And I don't really have a particular point to make about this. Like, is this a meaningful thing other than there's a flip side to the developing appreciation for something, just as it would be the case if you became a wine snob or a bicycle snob. And once you know what you like, what you know what works and doesn't work, you have a hard time being content riding a lousy bike or having a lousy glass of wine. It's like you used to be able to deal with it, now you can't. All right. Final pitfall here. So vitality of place. And the focus here is not on economic vitality, which is one of the contexts where you hear this, not so much in terms of place, but I'm not thinking about it in these terms. So just help me out here. When you think about the word vitality as it is associated with place, in social, cultural sense, what comes to mind? Like, what are some pre-association words that come to mind?
Signs of life.
Life.
Energy.
Activity.
Activity.
Diversity.
Diversity. Okay. And this is, like, diversity, I think, would be, to me, like, fits in the category of maybe a predictor of vitality as opposed to, like, a sign of vitality itself. But I'm asking you this because, in part, because I don't have a concrete definition that I feel that I can impose upon you, because it is an abstract concept. But in general, people tend to agree, like, what is it we're talking about? Energy, if we think about a person who has vitality, youthful, sort of energetic, but there is an optimism, enthusiasm, activity. We'll just leave it abstract. But we're not talking about economic vitality. So why is this pitfall? How does aesthetically pleasing architecture promote vitality in place? Well, first of all, it does help vitality place in many ways. So if you're in an environment that has good architecture that is, and I should also clarify, like, aesthetically pleasing architecture, of course, there's going to be individual differences. People appreciate some things versus others, but my premise is that in general, there's some forms of architecture that are more broadly embraced than other forms of architecture. So it's not just like, it just depends, that there are certain things that we can agree are more aesthetically pleasing or not for the masses. But yeah, if you have architectural impressiveness, things that are compelling, like, people want to be around that, and that's a good thing. So it makes people want to take care of their community, their place, sense of civic pride, and people want to live in that environment. And that's a great thing for vitality, because you don't have vitality in place if you don't have people. But the problem is that, and this is the angle that we're taking here today, is that it can also undermine vitality in place. And the aspect here is that when you have something that's attractive, there's competition for that which is attractive. If you have competition for something that's attractive, wealth is ultimately going to come into play for who wins the battle for who gets to claim or be in the environment as something that's aesthetically pleasing. And the argument further is that the more you inject wealth into a place, the more wealthy a place becomes, you start to run into issues where there could be constraints placed on vitality because of the nature of wealth and how it affects people psychologically and behaviorally. So, and just in terms of vitality, so this is like a list of the things that I think, from in part a structural standpoint, like probably what has to be the case to begin with. So you need to have people in proximity, there's some density, that there's some public space. Like, you can't have people that are completely in private elements, that people can see each other, there's an awareness of other people. You know, there's a mixed use component to the thing. A lot of this is just like walkable communities is part of it. Are you kind of forced to basically be in a public space, interact with other people? And where do you find these kinds of things? I mean, in general, this kind of place vitality, I think you're pretty much limited to urban and forms of suburban areas. And in particular, in the United States at least, we're really talking about urban and first ring suburbs, more historic suburbs, and particularly those that were built before the cars became the standard mode of transportation. So there had to be some proximity, convenience, and frankly, like in this area of the country where people had to be outside for air conditioning reasons. So you really had to be sort of publicly exposed, publicly accessible. You're really forcing people to have accidental social encounters, whether you want to or not. And if you think about gentrification, the concept of gentrification, I mean, basically, if you think about neighborhoods where gentrification is perceived to be an issue, like, we're mainly talking about these kinds of areas. I don't hear about gentrification in the exurbs. It's not a thing. A lot of times it already starts as something that one would consider to be gentrified. And gentrification, I'm thinking of it generally in terms of an infusion of wealthier people moving into an area that was inhabited presently by less wealthy people. So there's an elevation of wealth. All right, so this argument that attractive architecture attracts wealth, well, wealthy people live where they want to live. There's more of an ability to be interested in form and have that be a part of your preference. It's not just living where you can. You don't have to settle if you're a wealthy person. And of course, how something looks, whether it's architecturally impressive, good looking, like this presumably plays into decisions of residence, more for wealthy people than for unwealthy people. So it's a status symbol for sure, something that, especially to the extent that it's impressive. And of course, if this is the case, and wealth, if good architecture is a magnet for wealthy people, then it would stand to reason you have a raising of property values, that wealthy people are able to pay more for the properties, they take care of their properties, which continually makes the place continue to look good and perhaps look as good as it can look. You're going to preserve that, take care of it. You're going to outsource the maintenance of that property. And of course, if you're a wealthy person, people have a tendency to want to live around people who are similar to them. And also, wealthy people would like to live in areas that are idealistic. Like you live in a place that has comfort, safety, these kinds of considerations. So here's the problem with wealthy people, as the argument is. First of all, I would argue that people in general, like if you give them choice, full autonomy, are probably going to overdo it in terms of maximizing comfort and security. Like most people don't have the luxury of being able to really truly maximize this. Like we have to deal with some level of insecurity. We can't be as comfortable as we can because we just really can't afford to. It's inaccessible. But in the modern era, if you have enough wealth, like you can really have some quite high levels of safety, comfort. And if you're wealthy, you don't have to rely on other people. You really don't have to be as interdependent as less wealthy people. You can get the job done. You can live in relative isolation, at least in terms of the people in your surrounding environment. So you don't have to rely on people who happen to be nearby as friends, as resources. You can kind of hop over the people in your nearby environment to get with the people you want to get with and fulfill your social needs. If you're wealthy, you're not taking the bus. You're probably, if I think about my neighborhood that I live in, is a neighborhood that would fit the definition of a historic first-rank suburb. So when wealthy people move into my neighborhood, like one of the symptoms is the first thing that happens is the chain link fence becomes a privacy fence. That's one of the things that happens. Another thing that tends to happen is that people have a tendency to orient more towards, instead of being on the front porch hanging out, they tend to go to the back porch, the back deck. It becomes more of a I don't know these people. It's harder to get to know these people because, in part, they're accustomed to living a lot of times in a more modern suburban space that is not such a public access. People are used to having more privacy. And if you're a wealthy person, like you're not putting up with any kind of riffraff in your neighborhood. Like if there's a problem, do something about it. Like you apply, you put your money toward it, you put your political juice toward it. You're not going to deal with problems. Your orientation is not to adapt, to deal with it, like people who lack wealth and power. You're going to try to snuff those problems out. And what you consider to be a problem is probably likely to be a little bit of paranoia that's likely to play into this if you're a wealthy person. If you're accustomed to dodging what seems to be something that's slightly sketchy, unsafe, you probably don't really develop a sense of what you should be afraid of and what you should not be afraid of. And you don't really get good at operating, being competent, comfortable in circumstances that you don't have full control over. And of course, we have less empathy for people who are unlike us, and if you're not hanging out with people who are not themselves wealthy, you're probably not going to have a good understanding, comfort level with people who are relatively less wealthy. If you think of vitality in a person, it's hard to argue that old people tend not to have as much vitality. And if your neighborhood is full of old people, and old people have more of a tendency to be wealthy, you're probably not going to have as much of this like sensation-seeking kind of an orientation if your neighborhood is full of wealthy people who are likely to be old. You've got this high cost of living issue, which of course is a gentrification problem. As was mentioned earlier, diversity. When I ask people about, in general, what do they think of when they think of place vitality, diversity comes up quite often. And also we have this issue that's a very symptomatic of gentrification where your mom and pop places get replaced by things that are more generic and corporate. Efficient, money-making, but less interesting, less unique. All right, so that's the problem here. And just to lay out, so I'm going to make an argument here that, and this is an argument that when I ask people what's the relationship between socioeconomic status and vitality, people generally make the argument that it's somewhere in the middle, like having moderate socioeconomic status, moderate economic vitality is actually like where the social and cultural vitality is highest. So if we go on this continuum of socioeconomic status, so the argument here is that higher vitality is in the middle of the economic range and not so much on the outside. So we have high SES over here. This is the end stage gentrification, if we want to think about it, and this is no gentrification happening whatsoever. So here, aesthetically pleasing architecture is an advantage. Like this gives the community hope, a possibility that we're going to move out of some kind of dystopia into something that's higher in vitality. This is a good thing. We like attractive architecture. It makes people want to do something about problems. We get into this range. Pleasing architecture is good in the sense that it reduces the risk of backsliding. We're moving in a negative direction from a safety socioeconomic standpoint. I think of it as more of a stabilizing thing. It's more likely that you're going to go this way as opposed to this way if you have attractive architecture. All right, so those are good things about attractive architecture, but here it starts to become more of a challenge. If it's aesthetically pleasing and you're in this range, you're starting to get higher, like gentrification is already happening, then if you have something that's attractive, it actually makes it less likely that you're going to go in this direction, which may or may not be good, but it also makes it more likely that you're going to go in this direction. And this would be like, if the far left side is dystopia, this would be like Disney, like Disneyfication. If you think of, if you're familiar with like master plan communities with architectural merit, new urbanism types of things, and I don't know, a lot of the places that I've visited, like Seaside, Florida, things like that, you get into this where it's really like attractive, but something like on a vitality standpoint is somehow missing. So anyhow, that's the basic argument. And just to kind of wrap up here. So the idea here is that there are some problems associated with attractive architecture, which seems counterintuitive, but and perhaps these discussions are happening in other circles that I don't happen to run in, but it's an unfamiliar argument to me. And when I have conversations with my architects friends, they give me blank looks, so I thought it would be worth throwing it out there. You can't, part of it is just like from a perceptual standpoint, if you really want to maximize how beautiful moving something is, you need to have like figure ground, like signal noise. And if there's no baseline of something that's less impressive, then how are you really going to appreciate something that's truly beautiful? If everything is beautiful, then there's no contrast. But then I think the most important, what I think is what I'm most compelled by is the idea that from a neighborhood standpoint, a place standpoint, that perhaps the sweet spot for vitality is actually to try to balance your good and your bad. And instead of trying to make everything as good as it can be and hope that vitality will somehow survive, then maybe you should be more intentional about thinking, well, if everything looks great, if we don't have any problems in our neighborhoods that are superficially evident, then maybe wealth invasion is going to be inevitable. Like maybe there's something to the idea that perhaps leaving some pockets of ordinariness, or I mean my broader idea outside of architecture is just that if some forms of problems in our communities that are superficially evident maybe aren't worth snuffing out. Like maybe avoiding the attractiveness, making a community less attractive to outsiders might actually have some value in terms of vitality maintenance. And just it's like one example, so from a historic preservation standpoint, so I feel a little uncomfortable when in my neighborhood, and I definitely have place great value in historic architecture, and I want to maintain that, like that is my impulse. But then when I think, what am I doing? Like if I fear that my community is going to fall prey to end-stage gentrification, I think that's problematic. Like, should I be trying to preserve this? Like maybe I should invite this, and this is radical weirdness, but like if I want to like put my money where my ideas are, then perhaps I should celebrate the addition of this Habitat for Humanity, not so interesting architecture right next door to me, because maybe it allows me to maintain my status quo and vitality. I don't like looking at that, but I can look at this and feel happy, and maybe that should be the balance that I should strive for, and I will stop there. Thank you for listening. time for questions?
Is,